When the soldier returned home after 5 years at war, he pushed open the old door and froze. His dying grandfather lay in a dusty room with just $12 left in his wallet while his parents flaunted a $15,000 yacht in Ibiza, captioned, "Leaving the weight behind to truly fly." What horrifying truth is waiting for you? Do not look away. The story begins right now. The tires of my truck crunched against the dry, sun-baked earth of the driveway in Ironwood Ridge. It had been 5 long years since I last stood on this porch. Back then I was a young man leaving for service with a heart full of naive duty. Now I was Thatcher Vance, a man who had seen the jagged edges of the world only to find the true tragedy waiting in the house that raised me. The air here was different than the desert. It smelled of sharp pine resin and the low, heavy scent of damp, rotting wood that had begun to claim the porch steps. I pushed the front door open. It was not locked. It gave way with a tired groan of hinges that had not been oiled in years. Inside, the silence was not empty. It was a physical weight. It pressed against my eardrums, stagnant and suffocating, broken only by a mechanical hiss and a rhythmic electronic beep that echoed from the living room. I walked through the hallway, my heavy boots kicking up fine clouds of dust that danced in the dying Colorado light. The living room had been stripped of its life. The handmade furniture was pushed haphazardly into corners to make room for a cold metal hospital bed. There lay Otis. His frame, once as solid and unyielding as the oaks surrounding this valley, was now frail and translucent. A plastic tube was taped to his face, forcing oxygen into lungs that could no longer fight for themselves. His eyes were closed, his skin the color of old parchment. I sat on the edge of a wooden chair, the bitter acidic taste of stale cold coffee still lingering on my tongue from a gas station cup hours ago. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the shadows of the room with a violent glow. The first thing that appeared was a notification from a social media app. There they were, Garrison and Arden, my parents. The sun of Ibiza was a golden halo on their skin. They were standing on the teak deck of a sleek white yacht, grinning at the camera, while holding crystal glasses filled with amber liquid. The ocean behind them was a perfect, taunting blue. The caption written by Arden read, "Paradise finally found. Sometimes you have to leave the weight behind to truly fly, living our best life." The weight they had left behind was currently gasping for air 2 feet away from me. I looked down at the bedside table. Among the cluttered pill bottles and a half-empty water pitcher, I found Otis' old, cracked leather wallet. I picked it up. The leather felt dry and brittle, much like the man in the bed. I opened it. Inside, tucked behind a faded photograph of me in my basic training uniform, were a few crumpled $1 bills and some copper coins. I counted them slowly, totaling exactly $12.42. That was every cent he had left in the world. My thumb scrolled through the digital trail of my parents' Mediterranean escape. Another post showed a blurred photograph of a printed receipt they had shared to boast about their extravagance. It was a rental fee for that specific yacht, $15,000 for a single afternoon. The contrast was a physical blow to my chest. $15,000 for a few hours of vanity and curated smiles, while the man who had built their entire world, the man who had worked 40 years in the mines to give them a life of comfort, did not have enough in his wallet to pay for a proper bedside nurse. I looked at the medical logbook lying next to the wallet. It was a graveyard of empty pages. The columns for nurse signature and medication administered were blank for the last 48 hours. No one had been here. The paradise my parents had found was funded by the neglect of the man who had given them everything. The mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine felt like a rhythmic accusation in the stillness. I looked at the thick layer of dust on the mantel covering the service medals Otis had earned in a different war. My hands, calloused and steady from years of holding a rifle under pressure, began to shake with a cold, focused anger. I was not just a grandson returning from the brink of the world. I was a witness to a crime of the heart. I reached out and touched his hand. The skin was papery and cool, the pulse beneath it thready and exhausted. "I am home, Otis," I whispered. He did not move, his eyelids did not flutter, but the rhythm of the machine seemed to stutter for a fraction of a second, as if the house itself recognized that a protector had finally returned to the ridge. The world of Ibiza, the cocktails, and the expensive yachts felt like a fever dream, but I knew the reality was coming. Garrison and Arden would return. They would come back for the house. They would come back for the land, but they did not know about the letter hidden in the safe. They did not know about the oath I had taken to the man who taught me how to be a man. I stood up and closed the wallet, tucking the $12.42 back into his drawer. The war had followed me home to Ironwood Ridge, and as I looked at the clock on the wall, I realized the countdown had already begun. There would be no retreat. I moved toward the small study at the back of the house, my mind racing as fast as the digital clock on the kitchen wall. I remembered what my grandmother Cora Vance had whispered to me before I deployed: "If the house ever feels cold, look behind the history." I pulled the heavy oak bookshelf away from the wall, the wood scraping harshly against the floorboards. There, embedded in the plaster, was a small gray wall safe. I did not need to guess the combination. I entered my military service number, the digits I had repeated to myself 1,000 times to stay grounded during the long nights of my deployment. The mechanism clicked with a heavy metallic finality. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet that had grown thin with age, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out and felt the weight of its contents. My name was written on the front in chorus, elegant, unwavering script, for Thatcher, when honor is all that remains. I broke the wax seal and began to read. It was not just a will, it was a tactical maneuver. Cora had understood the character of her son Garrison better than anyone. She had inserted a specific legal instrument known as the 14-hour presence clause. The document stated that if Otis became incapacitated and the primary heirs were absent for more than 144 consecutive hours, without a documented medical emergency, their rights to the estate would be suspended. However, for the clause to be legally binding, a secondary heirme had to be present at the bedside and notify the estate executor within 14 hours of discovery. I looked at my watch. I'd already been in the house for 3 hours. The clock was ticking. I reached for the telephone and dialed the number for Clara Page, the volunteer nurse who had been mentioned in the local hospital records. When she answered, her voice was weary but sharp. I explained who I was and what I had found. Within 20 minutes, she arrived at the front door carrying a digital tablet and a folder of handwritten logs. "I have been trying to reach your parents for days, Thatcher," Clara said as she stepped into the dim light of the hallway. "I left messages. I called the hotel in Ibiza. I told them Otis was failing. They never called back. The medical logs show that no one has signed for his medication or checked his vitals since last Tuesday." I took the logs from her. It was the empirical proof I needed. I immediately contacted Elias Thorne, the estate attorney. His voice was like gravel cold and professional. "If you want to protect this house, Thatcher, you must transmit those logs and a sworn statement from the nurse to my office by 2 in the afternoon. If you miss that window by even a minute, the estate defaults to the primary heirs regardless of their absence. You have less than 11 hours left." As Clara went to the living room to check the oxygen levels for Otis, I turned my attention back to the safe. There was a second folder tucked at the very bottom, hidden beneath a stack of old property deeds. I pulled it out, expecting to see more of chorus poetry or perhaps some family heirlooms. Instead, I found a series of documents from Ironwood Savings and Loan. My blood turned to ice as I read the headers. It was a second mortgage application. The amount was a staggering $612,000. I flipped to the final page looking for the date. It had been executed only 18 months ago, just 3 days after Otis had been admitted to the hospital for his first minor stroke. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It said Otis Vance, but the loops of the letters were too rhythmic, the pressure of the pen too consistent. I knew that handwriting. It was not the shaky script of a man recovering from a neurological event. It was the practiced, aggressive cursive of my mother Arden. They had not lost this money through bad luck or a failing economy. They had sat in a hospital room, watched an old man struggle to remember his own name, and used his hand to sign away the very roof over his head. They were not just waiting for him to die so they could inherit the land. They had already stolen the equity. The $612,000 had been spent on the yachts, the cocktails in St. Bart's, and the designer clothes I saw on their social media profiles. They were not just negligent, they were predators. They had committed a financial assassination against their own father, and they had used my name and my credit as a silent shield to buffer their own debts. I looked at Otis, the man who had taught me that a man's word is his bond, and I felt a surge of protective fury that surpassed anything I had felt on the battlefield. I picked up the medical logs and the forged mortgage papers. I had 10 hours and 42 minutes to make sure they never set foot on this property again. I began to scan the documents, the light of the copier flickering against the darkened walls of the study like a signal fire. The war was no longer in a distant land. It was here in the silence of Ironwood Ridge. I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen, the blue light of my laptop screen reflecting in the cold, stagnant coffee on the table. To secure a private nursing service and advanced medical equipment for Otis, I needed to provide a financial guarantee. I logged into my banking portal expecting to see the clean slate of a soldier who had spent nothing while deployed. Instead, I saw a crater where my future should have been. My credit score was 425. The number was a death sentence in the modern American financial system. Anything below 500 is considered deep subprime, a zone where you cannot rent an apartment, buy a vehicle, or even qualify for a basic credit card. I began to pull my official reports from the three major credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, I was entitled to see the data, and the data was agonizing. There were dozens of inquiries from high-interest predatory lenders I had never heard of. There were black market payday loans taken out in my name while I was in a combat zone. My parents had used my Social Security number as a recurring fountain of cash. I had been fighting for their freedom while they were systematically enslaving my financial future. The betrayal felt like a physical weight heavier than any rucksack I had ever carried. I leaned my head in my hands, the silence of the house amplified by the hiss of the oxygen machine in the next room. I struggled with the urge to simply walk away. If I stayed, I would be tethered to a $612,000 debt and a destroyed reputation. If I left, the house would be seized by the bank. Otis would be moved to a state facility, and my parents would likely find a way to profit from the wreckage. I was a soldier without a base, a grandson without a home. The sound of a heavy diesel engine breaking the silence of the ridge snapped me back to attention. A black truck pulled into the dirt driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I stood up, my hand instinctively reaching for the tactical knife on the counter. A large man stepped out of the truck. His silhouette was unmistakable. It was Knox Miller, my former sergeant, and the only man who had seen me at my absolute worst during the insurgency. I heard the tires on the gravel from 2 miles away. "Thatcher," Knox said, his voice a low rumble as he stepped onto the porch. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew I was not. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the documents scattered across the table. He picked up the credit report and the mortgage papers I had found in the safe. "They did not just take the money, Knox," I said, my voice cracking. "They buried me under it." Knox looked at the reports with a grim intensity. "This is a classic case of financial exploitation of the elderly Thatcher. You are not alone in this fight. In this state, under the Elder Abuse Prevention and Prosecution Act and Title 18 of the Colorado Revised Statutes. What Garrison and Arden did is a felony. They targeted Otis because he was vulnerable, and they targeted you because you were absent." He sat down across from me, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "I have a network, Thatcher. There are veterans in this valley who work in forensic accounting and others who serve in the local sheriff's department. We see this happen too often to our brothers coming home. You have the medical logs from Clara Page and the forged documents from the safe. That is enough to trigger a criminal investigation into elder abuse. I looked toward the living room where Otis lay. The house is underwater by over $500,000 Knox. Even if I win the legal battle, I lose the roof. Not necessarily, Knox countered. If we can prove the mortgage was obtained through fraud and identity theft, we can petition the court to stay the foreclosure. Under federal law, a contract signed under fraudulent pretenses is voidable. But you have to stay. You have to be the one to sign the affidavits. You have to be the presence they cannot ignore. Hope, a feeling I had suppressed for years, began to flicker. I realized that my parents had counted on my silence and my shame. They expected me to see the 425 credit score and run. They did not expect me to bring the war to them. I am staying, I said, my voice steady for the first time since I arrived. Good, Knox replied. I will call the others. We will set up a perimeter around this case. By the time Garrison and Arden land in this state, they will not be walking into an empty house. They will be walking into a courtroom. I turned back to the laptop and began drafting the initial report for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I was no longer just a victim of identity theft. I was the lead investigator in a case that would strip my parents of everything they had stolen. The ghosts of the past were still there, but for the first time, I was the one haunting them. The roar of a high-end luxury sport utility vehicle shattered the morning quiet of Ironwood Ridge. I stood by the window of the living room watching as Garrison and Arden stepped out. They were dressed in expensive linen and designer silk, their skin tanned to a deep bronze from the sun of the Mediterranean. They did not look like grieving children. They looked like tourists who had been inconvenienced by a flight delay. They were accompanied by a man in a sharp charcoal suit carrying a leather briefcase, their legal counsel. They did not knock. Garrison pushed the door open with such force that it struck the interior wall. He did not look toward the hospital bed where his father lay. He did not ask the nurse, Clara Page, about the condition of the man gasping for air. Instead, he fixed his gaze on me. Out, Thatcher, Garrison commanded, his voice booming through the house. You have occupied this property long enough. We have filed an emergency injunction. This house is being placed under a receivership until we can settle the estate. Arden stepped forward, pulling her sunglasses up to rest on her head. Her eyes were cold and analytical. We know what you are trying to do, Thatcher. You found some old papers from a woman who was not in her right mind when she wrote them. But you are forgetting one very important detail. You are not fit to make medical or financial decisions for this family. Their lawyer stepped forward, sliding a document across the oak table. My clients have concerns regarding your mental stability, Mr. Vale. Your military discharge papers mention significant trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. Under the current state statutes, an individual suffering from severe psychological distress cannot be granted power of attorney or executor status over an estate of this magnitude. We are requesting an immediate psychological evaluation and your removal from the premises. I stood perfectly still. I did not speak. I did not defend my service or my mind. I simply watched them. The silence in the room began to stretch, becoming thick and uncomfortable. Garrison, unnerved by my lack of reaction, began to pace the room. He grabbed a small box from the mantel, the box where I had placed my silver star and my purple heart after cleaning them. You think these pieces of metal make you a hero? Garrison sneered. They make you a liability. You brought the war home with you, and now you are trying to use it to steal our inheritance. In his agitation, Garrison flipped the box over. My silver star tumbled out, clattering onto the hardwood floor. It landed in a patch of dust near his expensive Italian loafers. Garrison did not pause. He took a deliberate step forward and brought his heel down directly onto the metal. I heard the faint, sickening crunch of the delicate metal pin bending under his weight. He ground his shoe into the floor, smearing the ribbon with the dirt from his soles. Clara Page gasped from the corner of the room, her hand flying to her mouth. Knox Miller, who had been standing in the shadows of the kitchen, tensed his muscles, his jaw locking in fury, but I remained motionless. I did not move toward Garrison. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at the spot where his shoe covered my sacrifice. My silence was not a sign of weakness. It was a tactical choice. I was recording every word and every movement through the security system Knox had helped me install an hour earlier. Every insult, every display of utter disrespect for the military, and every callous disregard for the dying man in the bed was being digitized and saved. "Say something," Garrison shouted, leaning into my personal space. "Tell us how you are going to save the house now that the bank knows you have no money and no sanity left." I took a single slow breath. I looked past him at Arden, who was busy checking her reflection in the glass of a family photograph. They were so consumed by their own perceived victory that they failed to notice the small green light blinking on the bookshelf behind them. They failed to realize that by attacking my mental health and stepping on my service, they had just handed me the emotional testimony that would turn the entire community of Ironwood Ridge against them. "I do not need to say anything, Garrison," I finally whispered, my voice calm and devoid of emotion. "The house is already speaking for itself." I turned my back on them and walked toward Otis. I adjusted his blanket with a steady hand, ignoring the lawyer who was still barking threats about a court order. I had the medical logs. I had the forged mortgage documents. And now I had the visual evidence of their true character. The masks had not just slipped, they had shattered. Garrison let out a frustrated growl and turned to his lawyer. "See, he is unresponsive. He is catatonic. Document this." They believed my silence was a symptom of my trauma. They did not understand that in the world I had come from, the most dangerous man in the room is the one who stops talking. I looked at the clock. There were only 4 hours left before the 14-hour window closed. The trap was set, and my parents had walked directly into the center of it. The courtroom was small, but the tension inside was enough to burst the windows. The gallery was filled with the residents of Ironwood Ridge, people who had known my grandfather Otis and grandmother Cora for 40 years. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Garrison and Arden sat across the aisle, their posture arrogant, flanked by a legal team that radiated expensive confidence. Their lead attorney stood before the judge, a man whose voice was polished to a predatory sheen. "Your Honor," he began, "we are dealing with a tragic situation. However, the law is clear. Thatcher Vance is a man suffering from documented psychological trauma. His credit history is a disaster, showing a complete lack of financial responsibility. To hand the legacy of the Vance family over to an unstable individual would be a dereliction of duty. My clients are the natural heirs, and they are the only ones capable of managing this estate." He gestured toward me, as if I were a broken piece of machinery. He has spent his time since returning in a state of silent withdrawal. He is not a protector. He is a man hiding from a reality he cannot face. Elias Thorne. My attorney stood up slowly. He did not look at the opposing counsel. He looked at the judge. Character is not defined by a bank statement, and honor is not a symptom of a mental illness, Elias said quietly. My client remained silent because the truth does not need to shout. We have one final piece of evidence from the USB drive found in Cora Vance's safe. A screen was lowered from the ceiling. The room darkened. My grandmother's face appeared, her gaze as sharp as a diamond. "If you are watching this," she said, her voice echoing through the silent court, "it means my son has finally chosen his greed over his blood. I knew the moment they asked for the first mortgage that they would eventually try to erase the man who gave them life. I did not just leave a will, Thatcher. I left a witness." The video cut to a grainy, wide-angle view of the living room back at the house. The timestamp in the corner showed it was exactly 7 days ago, 3 days before I arrived. The house was quiet. Otis lay in his bed, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the oxygen machine. A figure entered the frame. It was Garrison. He looked around the room with a frantic, sweating intensity. He did not go to his father's side to comfort him. He walked straight to the wall outlet where the life support machine was plugged in. He looked at the machine, then at the door. He reached down. The courtroom held its collective breath. On the screen, Garrison's fingers closed around the black power cord. With a quick, violent jerk, he pulled the plug from the wall. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine died instantly. The alarm on the monitor began to flatline a shrill, piercing scream that filled the courtroom. Garrison stood there for 5 seconds, watching his father struggle for air, his face a mask of cold, calculated indifference. Then the door at the edge of the frame began to open. Clara Page was entering for her shift. Garrison panicked. He scrambled to his knees, fumbling with the cord, and jammed it back into the socket just as the nurse stepped into the room. He stood up, pretending to check the settings on the monitor, his voice on the recording audible. "The machine just made a strange noise, Clara. I think it is failing." The video froze on Garrison's face-to-face, caught in the act of attempted murder for an inheritance. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so heavy it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the courtroom. Then a low murmur began to rise from the gallery, a wave of collective disgust. Arden's face turned a sickly shade of gray. Garrison stared at the screen. His mouth hanging open, the arrogance stripped away to reveal the hollow core of a coward. The judge did not need to hear another word. He looked at Garrison and Arden with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. He brought his gavel down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "This petition for receivership is denied," the judge thundered. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate arrest of Garrison Vance on charges of attempted murder and elder abuse. This court will also initiate a full forensic audit of the mortgage fraud mentioned in the evidence. Thatcher Vance, you are the sole executor and protector of this estate. This hearing is adjourned." I sat still as the bailiffs moved toward my parents. I did not feel joy. I did not feel a sense of victory. I only felt the weight of the silver star in my pocket, the one my father had stepped on, and the profound, quiet relief that the man in the bed at Ironwood Ridge would finally sleep in peace. The war was over. The clicking of handcuffs was the only sound that followed the final strike of the judge's gavel. Garrison and Arden were led out through the side door of the courtroom. Their heads finally lowered the designer silk of their clothing, now a mocking contrast to the steel circles around their wrists. There were no cameras flashing for their social media profiles now, only the cold, hard eyes of a community that had seen their true nature. As the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, the silence that settled over Ironwood Ridge felt like the first clean breath of air the valley had taken in decades. I returned to the house alone. Otis had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 nights after the hearing, as if he had been holding on to his last embers of life just long enough to see the truth revealed. He died in his own bed under the roof he had built with his own hands, surrounded by the scent of the pines he loved, rather than the antiseptic smell of a state-run facility. I stood in the living room and began the work of clearing away the wreckage. I removed the hospital bed, the oxygen tanks, and the monitors that had hummed like mechanical vultures. I scrubbed the floors and opened every window, letting the mountain breeze wash away the stagnant memories of neglect. But I did not sell the house. I did not take the money and disappear to find my own version of paradise. Instead, with the guidance of Elias Thorne and the tireless support of Knox Miller, we established the Vance Foundation. The house on the ridge was no longer a place of isolation. The study where the safe had hidden the truth became a legal aid office for veterans fighting their own battles against financial exploitation. The living room became a sanctuary where the coffee was always hot and the doors were never locked for those who had sacrificed everything only to find themselves forgotten. On a clear, crisp morning in November, a group of veterans gathered in the front yard. The Colorado sun was bright, reflecting off the snow-capped peaks in the distance. Knox Miller stood at attention as I stepped onto the porch holding the wooden box from the mantel. Inside was the flag that had covered my grandmother Cora, the one Garrison had tried to bury under his greed. I walked down the steps and stood before Knox. I did not give him a speech about duty or sacrifice. I simply placed the folded triangle of stars and stripes into his steady, calloused hands. "The foundation needs a guardian," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet yard. "It needs to remind everyone who walks through that door that they are not alone." Knox nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep mutual understanding. It will stay right here, Thatcher. It will never be buried again. As I looked at the men and women standing on the land my grandfather had protected, I realized that my credit score and my bank account were no longer the measures of my worth. The scars of the war were still there, but they had become a map rather than a burden. I had lost the family I thought I knew, but I had gained a brotherhood that could never be forged in a signature or a will. The story of the Vance family is not a story of a house or a mortgage. It is a testament to a simple truth that the world often forgets in its rush toward glamour and greed. Honor is not found in the amount of money you have, but in where you stand when the darkness falls. It is found in the silence of the bedside, in the steady hand that refuses to let go, and in the courage to face the truth when the world tells you to look away. I am Thatcher Vance. I stood my ground and I found my way home. If you found yourself standing in the doorway of a crumbling legacy with your future on the line and your family acting as your greatest enemy, what would you do? What would you do if you were Thatcher? What was your reaction to the final twist? Your perspective helps me create better and more impactful content for you. Please leave a comment, follow for more meaningful stories, and join our growing community. Every voice reminds me that honor still matters. Thank you for standing with me today.